So today we are going to talk about the Dred Scott decision. So the first thing you need to do is make sure you have a correct heading on your paper. Name, date, Social Studies 8, period, whatever. And once you do that, then you're going to put a correct title. And the title is The Dred Scott Decision, a Timeline. And once you're finished doing that, then you're going to fold your paper in half, hot dog style. And then go ahead and draw a line in the fold. Now the reason we're doing that is I thought it might be interesting to take notes as a timeline today. So for those of you who have to take Cornell notes for Avid, no big deal. You will still be doing that. Timeline style, it's just that you will include a summary at the end and adding a couple of questions. All right, so let's get started. With 1800, Dred Scott was born. Now, some people can argue that. Some people think maybe he was born earlier, 1795. Has come up. I've seen 1803, but we're just going to round to 1800. And he was born a slave in Virginia. And then we're going to skip quite a bit space. And we're going to skip to 1820. Because that was when the Missouri Compromise was. And we have recently just learned about the Missouri Compromise. So I'm going to give you a minute to discuss the Missouri Compromise. And then we're going to finally move to 1830. And again, you're going to skip quite a substantial amount of space. And in 1830, Dred Scott traveled to St. Louis, Missouri with his master, Peter Blow, and the Blow family. Sadly, in 1832, Peter Blow dies. And so Dred Scott is purchased by a United States Army surgeon named Dr. John Emerson. And because Dr. John Emerson worked as a doctor for the United States Army, he took Dred Scott to Fort Armstrong. And Fort Armstrong is in the state of Illinois. So in 1836, Scott travels to Illinois, a free state where he lives for 2 years. Now remember, folks, Dred Scott's a slave. He is now living for 2 years in a free state. Is he a slave? Remember, Illinois does not allow slavery. So for the 2 years that Dred Scott is living in Illinois, is he a free man or is he still a slave? Side note, Illinois was a free state because of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And hopefully you remember when we talked about the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Feels like now a million years ago, but it was towards the beginning of the school year. So I want to take a moment and pause so that we can discuss the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And if you have to look this up, please make sure you do so, but I expect everybody to tell me what was the Northwest Ordinance. I'll give you a minute to find it, and then we're going to talk about it. Okay, In 1838, Dred Scott and Dr. Emerson moved to Wisconsin Territory. Actually, Dr. Emerson and Dred Scott moved to Fort Snelling, which is actually today Minnesota, but at the time it was just part of Wisconsin Territory. And again, it is another free area, and that area was made free because of the Missouri Compromise of 1820. In 1839, Dred Scott marries Harriet Robinson, and she had been purchased by Dr. Emerson so that Dred Scott and Harriet could be married. In 1843, Dr. Emerson dies. So for 4 years after Emerson dies, Mrs. Emerson leases out the Scott family. And the Scott family is Dred Scott, his wife Harriet, and their daughter. And so they are leased to other people. And finally in 1847, Dred Scott sues Mrs. Emerson for his freedom. Now, why didn't he do this before? Nobody really knows. He lived in Illinois. He could have done it there. He lived in Wisconsin Territory. He could have done it there. He was even in Louisiana. And if he had, at the time, his family was in Louisiana, sued, many scholars are fairly certain he would have gotten his freedom. But he waits till 1847 to sue for his freedom, and he loses in a Missouri court. And his argument in that Missouri court was that he had lived in free states, so therefore he should be freed. Now the reason he loses is because of a technicality where Scott had failed to provide a witness to testify that he was in fact a slave belonging to Mrs. Emerson. So because they couldn't prove he was a slave owned by Mrs. Emerson, he loses the court case. Now, in the middle of this is the Compromise of 1850. So please put that on one side of your paper, because on the other side of the paper, you're going to write, Dred Scott's case was retried. And I don't know quite what happened there, but some of the writing got overlapped. So make sure you don't do that. Make sure you just write on this side of the line. So Dred Scott's case is retried, and the circuit court case ruling was Scott and his family were free. Now, this is really upsetting for Mrs. Emerson. And the reason it's so upsetting is because Mrs. Emerson was living off of the money that the Scott family was providing her by being leased out. So she argues and appeals the case. So in 1852, Dred Scott and his family go back to court, and this time they're at the Missouri Supreme Court, and the Missouri Supreme Court reverses the circuit court ruling. Dred Scott is still a slave, and the Missouri Supreme Court protects slave owners by saying slaves living in free states are still slaves. One year later, in 1853, Dred Scott hires a new lawyer. And this time it's Dred Scott versus Sanford. And Sanford is Mrs. Emerson's brother. Mrs. Emerson needed help with the court situation, and her brother was happy to help her. So now she has changed ownership of the slaves. Now the slaves are owned by Mrs. Emerson's brother, Sanford, and they go back to court again, and he loses again. I've got a little bit of an overlap here. So please make sure that you are writing in 1856. United States Supreme Court said Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Scott was still legally a slave, even when he was in non-slave states like Illinois or Wisconsin Territory. Therefore, oh geez, look, I didn't capitalize the T. Please make sure you do that. The government couldn't ban slavery anywhere in the United States, even in states that had banned it themselves. Also in 1856, Chief Justice Taney said Scott was an African American and not a United States citizen. Because Scott was not a United States citizen, he had no right to sue for his freedom. Because in 1856, if you were not a United States citizen, you could not sue anybody in a court of law. That is now changed, by the way. Even if you are not an American citizen, you still have the same rights as an American citizen when you live in this in this country. So today, if you are not an American citizen, you still have the right to sue, but in 1856 you did not. (1857), and this whole line is so messed up, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to circle 1857, and I want you to write 1857 as close to the line as you can. And then next to 1857, you're going to write the United States Supreme Court ruled that Dred Scott was property based on the Fifth Amendment. And here is a picture of that famous decision. So one more time. The Fifth Amendment says, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger, nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb. Remember, that's our favorite. Nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use. And so what interests us and how this applies to Dred Scott is no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Here's the argument. Mr. Sanford should be compensated. He should get paid for his loss of his property, the Scott family. And so they're saying because Scott is simply property, if he were to be free, somebody would have to pay for it. In 1858, Mrs. Emerson marries a man against slavery. So she, her brother, both decide to sell the Scotts, and they are sold back to the children of Dred Scott's first master, Peter Blow, and the children of Peter Blow set the Scotts free. And you might have been asking yourself, where did Dred Scott get the money to hire all the lawyers and for all the court fees? The Blow family was paying for all that, which brings up another interesting question. Could the Blows have purchased the Scotts years ago and simply set them free? Also, in 1858, Dred Scott dies of TB. And so ends the story of Dred Scott. And I do have a copy of the obituary. You might notice the word manumitted. It's right there. That means to free from slavery or bondage, to emancipate. So it says that he was manumitted by his owner. So his owner allowed him to go free. So what is the impact of the Dred Scott decision? In the North, the Dred Scott decision served as an eye-opener to Northerners who believed that slavery was tolerable as long as it stayed in the South. Northerners were afraid the decision took away power Congress once had to regulate slavery in new territories. Northerners feared slavery could quickly expand into much of the western United States. And when slavery did expand into those territories, it could spread quickly into the once free states. And in the South saw it as a license to take their slaves wherever they wanted. And for everyone, states were allowed to make their own decisions, free or slave, which caused quite a bit of violence. And all this was happening during the Lincoln and Douglas debates. And during the debates, they were talking about the issues of the day because they were both running for senator of Illinois. And this decision did deny citizenship to all African Americans.